This.
For mobile phones, please. Do we have any apologies?
Paula?
Paula Bradley, okay,
It's
thank
in
you.
the chamber.
Yeah.
Okay, members, just a number of items under Chair's business. Obviously, now that the final budget allocations have been agreed for the Department's 2015-16, there was a number of issues that were pertinent to the committee, and I think it would be useful now to receive a briefing from officials on the spending plans for 15-16. If members do recall, when we did our review in around October, November time, the Department was not in a position at that stage to advise us on where they would make efficiency savings or the cuts to the, for example, the smaller arm's length bodies. They weren't able to tell us the shift left of money from hospitals to primary or community care, or the amount of transitional funding that they intend to allocate to transforming your care. And I suppose members would reflect on the evidence last week that indicated that there was only in the region of 2.5 million that was allocated for transforming your care in the last budget. So I do think it would be useful to invite the Department in to clarify those questions that have raised. So if members are content, we would write to the Department and ask them to come in and present the evidence.
Agreed.
Also, members will be aware that we had a very useful, I think, engagement yesterday in meeting with the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Health and Children. There was a number of areas, very specifically, of cooperation already taking place and areas to go forward on. We will produce a report for next week's meeting with a number of actions flowing from that meeting for members' information. Item 3 is the draft minutes of the meeting on Wednesday, the 4th of February. They're on page 6. Are members content with the minutes?
Right.
Thank you. Item 4 is the Food Hygiene Rating Bill, the Food Standards Agency briefing. Just advising members again that the clerk has prepared a memo which can be found at page 12 of your meeting pack. The briefing paper sets out the key issues raised in written and oral evidence that we've received to date on the bill. The bill, this is based on the clause by clause table, and it's in section 5 of your yellow bill folder. Again, referring members to the correspondence from the Food Standards Agency at page 19 of the pack. That sets out the proposed amendments to the bill in response to the issues raised in the Examiner of Statutory Rules report. The Examiner's report is in section 1 of your yellow bill folder, and you're very welcome. We have Michael Jackson from the Food Standards Agency and Catherine Baker from the Food Standards Agency, just advising yourselves that the committee has received a range of written and oral evidence that you will be aware of. So the purpose of today's session is really for us to make you aware of those issues and obviously for you to provide us with the response in terms of your response. Again, advising yourselves that the format of the meeting will be question and answer, and we'll take each clause in turn. Just again, the committee has received the FSA correspondence, and thank you for that in relation to the proposed amendments, and we will deal with this as we come to the relevant clauses. So I'm just going to invite questions at this stage from the members. And if I could just start in terms of, yes, because of in terms of clause 1, if I could maybe open on that. The Chief Environmental Health Officers Group had made the point that the Food Law Code of Practice encourages the removal of lower risk premises from inspection programmes or the use of lighter touch interventions rather than what was called a full inspection. So lighter touch interventions would not collect sufficient information to produce a rating. Therefore, they were concerned that for some premises, there will be no mechanism to renew the rating, and over time it will become outdated. Similarly, the Cooperative Food has stated also that councils are not required to inspect all food businesses, and therefore some food businesses won't have a rating. So I'm just wondering from your perspective how you would respond to that.
Okay. In terms of the views that were expressed by the chief officers, the substantive point there is that there are some very low-risk businesses which, when subject to either light touch interventions or alternative enforcement strategies, will not get an inspection as frequently as they currently would by the councils in Northern Ireland. Now, in terms of the requirement to conduct inspections, that is in essence the same at the moment through the Food Law Code practice in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Some of the councils in Northern Ireland have opted not to use the flexibilities. So it's not a question that we are looking to change and make things more flexible at this point in time. It's just about using the flexibilities that are there. And they are correct in saying that for certain businesses they have where there is the option to have a light touch intervention. There may be a visit which will not result in a rating, but the majority of the businesses will in due course the next time round get an inspection that would result in a re-rating. The only businesses which drop out of the scheme altogether are those which are of a very low risk nature. For example, if you had a clothes retailer that happened to be selling chocolate confectionery for Valentine's Day or something like that.
But does that, I suppose, leave a gap if there are some businesses that potentially wouldn't have a rating?
It doesn't leave a gap in terms of how the scope of the scheme is defined. And the vast majority of, well, the businesses which are within scope of the rating scheme as proposed will at some point in time receive an inspection that will allow a rating to take place. And the councils may also decide that they do not wish to avail of the flexibilities to conduct light touch interventions, and some may continue with inspections that would generate new ratings.
And is there any indication of what timescale we would be talking there in terms of businesses not having a rating?
If you were to consider a catering business which was being run very well, had good management systems in place, they were keeping on top of the maintenance, cleaning, had good procedures, through the application of the light touches allowed in the code of practice, that could mean that a very, very good business of that nature would, if the flexibility was applied, get an inspection once every 4 years. It would be visited at 2 yearly intervals, but the intermediate one, if they were adopting the light touch flexibility, would not necessarily gather information to allow a re-rating. The light touch visit may, if conditions have changed significantly, will trigger an inspection to be carried out, and therefore will allow the production of a new rating. So if you look at it in the context of a business, for example, gets a rating, gets an inspection today and it gets rated 5. If the light touch takes place in 2 years' time, the light touch will determine whether or not, in fact, that 5 is still right, because they'll be looking to see if there's been a significant change in the activities, the way the business is being run, the level of compliance. So if all is well, there's a logic in the fact that that rating would continue. If something has gone fundamentally wrong, then the light touch in effect stops and the inspection is carried out and a re-rating will be conducted. So there is a safeguard within the inspection system.
But I suppose one of the issues that the Cooperative Food had stated was that the clause wasn't necessary, and it's coming on the back of what you're saying, that there was only 2 scenarios where an inspection would be carried out within a short time of the previous one, and they talked about the re-rating if there's evidence of a food hygiene risk, but in both scenarios, the production of an up-to-date rating would presumably be required. And I'm just wondering your explanation for clause 1.2 being necessary to the bill.
The rationale for 1.2 is to recognise the fact that when a inspection is carried out, if the business is found not to be complying and there are significant issues, irrespective of the hygiene rating system, the council will automatically go back within a short space of time and conduct a further inspection to see that the business has done what is necessary. And it's to cover that scenario, because in that situation, quite often it is not appropriate to re-rate when they're effectively conducting an inspection to determine whether corrective action's been taken.
I think it's fair to say in those circumstances where an officer will do, I suppose what we term a compliance revisit, in the situation Michael's described, somebody is not complying to a level where the officer feels, I need to come back quite quickly here. I'm not prepared to wait very long to see that those issues have been rectified. They'll go back, but they'll probably only concentrate on the issues that needed to be rectified. So they're not going to make a full assessment of everything that you need to look at to generate a rating each time. They're going in to address those specific non-compliances. So it's just to take account for the fact that we're not imposing a requirement on the councils to have to make that be a big, large inspection each time to consider everything to generate the rating. It's for another purpose. It's to deal with non-compliances, to get them sorted out quickly. So that it's sort of like a technical nature, but it's just not to catch those particular visits.
Oh, okay. And again, just on clause 1, just point 4 in this, the consumer organisation, which they had stated that they believed that the legislation should also cover businesses to business supply of food, given that they had highlighted that that was the case in Wales. Yeah. I'm just looking your explanation as to why you're not planning to cover business-to-business trade in the first instance.
Well, there's a couple of aspects to that. The first one is that our view was that the best approach to getting the scheme up and running on a statutory basis was to work it on the same basis as the voluntary scheme, which is in terms of those businesses where consumers go directly to purchase food. So the primary reason for having the rating sticker displayed is so that people can make that decision. Now, when you're looking at trade-to-trade business, where the consumer is not going directly, that information would not be as meaningful, because it wouldn't be something that was being taken into consideration in the decision to purchase trade-to-trade. The other aspect is that if you're looking at a business making a decision to buy from another business, for them to do that in a very informed manner, there is a lot more information that they would need rather than just the basic of a food hygiene rating. So, for example, if you're making a decision that you're going to source from a given supplier, you would want to have information about their quality control systems, perhaps testing methods, etc. It would be a much more comprehensive picture that you would want to make that decision around the trade-to-trade aspect, particularly if you wanted to be able to establish a due diligence defence in the event of something going wrong, having obtained food from that source. The final point that I would raise is that clearly one of the points that was made by the Chief Officer's representation was that they are very mindful of the impending local government reform and the challenges that that's going to present. So again, our view was that the sensible approach would be to work on the same basis and not be bringing any new businesses in at the outset, because what probably wouldn't be apparent is that whenever the scheme was launched in the first place under the voluntaries, an awful lot of work is done to be able to get to the stage where you launch the scheme. So if we were going to bring trade to trade in from day one, there would be another significant amount of work that would need to be done with those businesses and getting them organised and prepared. And in terms of how we have put forward clause 1 at the moment. The option is clearly there. We're not saying that this isn't something to be considered, and we will be able to do that in due course, should the timing be right and there be a good case for it.
And if I, just on the back of what Michael has said there, if I drew your attention to clause 1.7, the department may by order amend the definition of food business establishment, and the amendment has been put in for that very reason, because the current definition relates only to those establishments supplying food directly to consumers. So there would be a possibility to amend that after a period of time, with the scheme operating as it currently does now on the voluntary basis, where it supplies information to consumers. And some evidence could be gathered and work could be done with the type of businesses that would then need to be brought into scope, and that could be done through an order, through a subordinate.
And you think
rule power.
1.7 covers that?
That's the exact reason for having 1.7.
reason for it, having it, to allow trade to be a possibility in the future. And it was similar to the way it was done in Wales. So they didn't have it at the outset either, but they brought them in then through subordinate rules, a wee bit further down the time.
Okay, Fergal was on this, yeah.
Just on the point that it might be in defence of not having business at this stage, in that at least your inspections do touch on other businesses, because obviously any business you're inspecting has a back door through which product comes, and from what we saw in the inspection, you're looking at their labelling, so you're in some ways touching on a business, although you're not inspecting that business's own production.
If the business that is within scope, your caterer is running that operation in a sensible way, taking their responsibilities properly, as you said, there will be checks that will take place on the goods arriving, and if there was anything obviously wrong, then they would be able to raise that with the supplier. And that's a much bigger picture than just about a rating in terms of food through the supply chain.
And I think as well you have to consider what this bill actually does is simply require the sticker which businesses voluntarily can display. It requires them to display, but you've got to ask yourself what benefit is it of asking a manufacturer to display a sticker, because manufacturers don't go to each other's doors to buy food. It's done in a different way. They will, they'll look at specifications, they'll audit them, so they won't be going to a door and looking for a sticker to make a decision.
And I suspect that through your inspection, if a meat business was presenting at a number of businesses' doors without proper standards, then the focus from an inspection point of view would go on to that further business.
Another point to note, whilst it doesn't apply to all manufacturers who ultimately would be the source of material that's being traded trade to trade, if you take, for example, the meat industry, because of the regimes that operate there in terms of audits and inspections which are delivered by district councils, there's already transparency around the findings of those audits. So we have a procedure in place whereby, for example, the slaughterhouses and fresh meat cutting establishments, when an audit is conducted, the full report is actually published by the Food Standards Agency. So there isn't a total, there isn't a whole part of the food chain which isn't covered.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Fergal. In terms of, again, Clause 1, Part 5, the Chief Environmental Health Officers Group and the Cooperative Food have both stated that the clause wasn't clear in terms of what constitutes an inspection for rating purposes, and then how it relates to the Food Law Code of Practice and the brand standard. Can you maybe clarify that position for us?
Yes.
Yes, I can see when you read the clause on its own, there's a lot of other information that they currently use, if you know what I mean, to determine what an inspection is, and we're assuming that that information will all still be relied on, so they'll still be referring to the Food Law Code of Practice, and what an inspection is will be detailed fully in the guidance that will support the bill in the way that it is done now currently through the brand standards. So there's no difference, there's no different intention with how the bill's drafted for what actually happens now to be any different with a statutory scheme. So when we say inspection, and Clause 5, as you've pointed out, relates it to being an official control under 882, those are certain types of activities that happen that are detailed in the Food Law Code of Practice, and we refer to those as inspections, partial inspections and audits, and it's only those type of visits that councils do where the full amount of information is gathered, where a rating could be generated. There's other visits they do, but those visits don't generate the full amount of information. So they go in for surveillance, they might go in for sampling visits, but they couldn't produce a rating in those circumstances. We fully intend to re-clarify that in guidance that would support the bill in exactly the same way it's done in the brand standard, so there'll be no difference to what currently happens.
So it will be, I suppose, validated or clarified in the guidance?
Yes, very much.
All right, folks, I'm going to have to adjourn the meeting. That's a vote. So
29.